Have you ever noticed how some losses arrive like thunder, sharp, loud, impossible to ignore, and others arrive like rain, slow and steady until one morning you wake up and everything has changed? Loss isn't always a headline. Often it's a string of small, quiet absences, a chair that stays empty, a joke that goes unheard, a number in your phone you no longer have the courage to dial. Today, we're going to sit with that quiet pain. The way losing someone you love reshapes your inside world, the science that tries to explain it, and the small, research-backed steps that can help you breathe again. Loss doesn't only take a person from your life. It takes routines, plans, identities, and possibilities. When someone you love is gone, your past, your present, and the futures you imagined all rearrange themselves, sometimes without your permission. The ordinary scaffolding of your days becomes foreign. For many people, grief shows up as physical fatigue, trouble sleeping, or a kind of fog over thinking. For others, it's bursts of crying, or a sudden anger, or an ache that never quite leaves. And for some, the grief lingers and becomes a chronic condition that affects day-to-day functioning. According to research on prolonged grief disorder, a meaningful minority of bereaved people experience intense, persistent yearning and impairment long after the expected time of mourning. Clinicians and researchers have recently begun to define and study this condition more precisely in diagnostic manuals, like the ICD-11 and DSM-5-TR. The careful work of classifying prolonged grief is helping doctors and therapists recognize when grief is evolving into something that needs targeted attention. If grief had a resident organ, it would be the brain, because grief changes how our brains respond to the world. In the early days after loss, the brain's alarm centers, regions like the amygdala, become more reactive. That means sudden reminders of the person can flood you with emotion and make your nervous system feel on edge. At the same time, parts of the brain involved in thinking and concentration can slow down, which explains the fogginess and memory lapses many people report. There's also compelling evidence that the brain's reward and attachment systems play a unique role in prolonged yearning. Research into the neurobiology of prolonged grief has shown that for some people, reminders of the deceased activate neural circuits usually associated with craving and reward, the same systems involved when a person longs for a lost love or even a past addiction. In other words, the brain can continue to treat the missing person like a reward it's searching for, which helps explain why yearning can feel like an aching craving that doesn't fade. And more recent imaging studies suggest that persistent, complicated grief can alter the resting state networks of the brain, the background patterns of connectivity that shape how we think and feel, even when we're not focusing on anything. These subtle changes may underlie why prolonged grief can make it hard to form new attachments or to shift attention away from loss. This isn't just poetic. The body follows the brain. Numerous studies show that bereavement increases risk for health problems, from sleep disruption and immune changes to cardiovascular strain. Epidemiological research has documented the widowhood effect, a measurable increase in mortality risk among those who lose a spouse, especially in the months immediately after the loss. This is a stark reminder that grief is not only an emotional experience, it's a physiological one with real health consequences. So when your appetite shifts, when your chest tightens, when your head won't stop replaying a moment, that's not weakness. That's biology responding to a major social and emotional change. Grief often knocks the wind out of identity. If you were a caregiver, a partner, a parent, or a routines keeper, the role you once played in the world disappears overnight. That absence can produce an existential ache. Who am I without the rhythms that tied me to that person? Psychologists describe this as losing parts of the self that were bound up with another person. When those parts go, the question of who am I now can be as painful as sadness itself. Culturally, we also receive mixed messages about how to grieve. Some narratives expect us to be stoic, others to be publicly sorrowful, and yet others to move on quickly. That social pressure complicates healing because it makes grief a private performance as well as a private pain. Let's clear up a few common myths. Myth 1. There are standard stages everyone goes through. While the Kubler-Ross stages, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance, are familiar, contemporary research and clinical experience show that grief is not a linear house with rooms you walk through. It's messy, circular, and intensely personal. Sometimes acceptance never comes in the neat way people expect. Critics and researchers have cautioned against rigidly applying stage models to real human sorrow. Myth 2. Time heals all wounds. Time helps some, but for others, time alone isn't enough. That's why researchers and clinicians differentiate between normal bereavement and prolonged, disabling grief that benefits from active treatment. Let me tell you a few small, true-to-life stories that illustrate how grief moves through ordinary life. 1. There's a woman who kept a mug in the sink for months because the mug had her partner's lipstick on the rim. She wasn't clinging to the mug. She was clinging to the evidence that he had been here, that their life had really happened. Removing the mug felt like erasing a memory. 2. A man described driving past a coffee shop every morning for years because that's where they'd planned their day together. He kept driving past for months, not stopping, because entering felt like stepping into a world he could no longer belong to. These are mundane details, a mug, a corner table, and yet they are the scaffolding of a life. When those scaffoldings collapses, grief lives in everyday things. These tiny experiences are consistent with research showing how loss is embedded in daily routines and how changes to those routines prolong distress for many people. For most people, grief slowly loosens its grip. For a significant minority, it doesn't. Studies looking at prevalence of prolonged grief disorder using ICD-11 or DSM-5-TR criteria find that rates vary across samples, but in many representative studies, the prevalence is meaningfully above zero, often in the range of a few percent to around 10%, depending on the method and population. These data tell us two things. First, most grieving people will not develop a disabling disorder. Second, a non-trivial number will, and they deserve recognition and access to evidence-based care. If this video touched something in you, consider reaching out to a friend, to a helpline, to a trained counselor. And if you're watching because you want to support someone who is grieving, the most research-backed kindness you can give is presence, patience, and permission to feel. Thank you for sitting with me. If you found this helpful, consider sharing it, not to fix grief, but to make sure no one has to be quiet about it alone.